There are lots of different parts to the building codes, and so we'll have a couple of different videos that will help you move into the building codes at some different levels of depth. We're going to start off with a kind of overarching analysis of the project in order to understand the way that the building codes are going to influence the design, particularly in relationship to the building size, the building height, and the use. And then also the way in which the building code makes provisions for safe egress, safe materials, and safe construction. All of the work that we're going to do relates to the international building codes, which govern building standards in both the United States and several countries. We are also mandated to work with the North Carolina building codes, but they are very similar to the international building codes, so we're not going to draw particular distinctions there. So the building codes are really just minimal standards of construction that have been developed over time to protect the health, welfare, and safety of building occupants. And many of the safety standards that have been developed in the building codes have been in response to devastating building fires. The analysis of your project is going to be done in two different parts. Part one, we're going to be looking at the basic provisions, as well as limitations on size, height, and construction materials. And in part two, we're going to be developing a deeper understanding of your project occupancy and the egress system to support the number of occupants that can be anticipated in your building. We're going to use this project code flowchart, which was developed by our own local building codes office, and it marches us through several interrelated steps by which we can start to assess the way that the building codes will affect a project. The first distinction that we need to make is related to the building use. Our project can either be a single-use project or a multiple-use project, and by definition, a mixed-use project will be multiple uses. Once we determine that we have multiple uses, we need to decide whether we're going to treat them as separated or not separated. If we decide to separate the uses, we will treat each area according to its own requirements by the building codes, and we will construct fire-resistive barriers between those areas. If we decide not to separate the uses, we need to choose the use which has the most restrictive requirements and follow those throughout the entire project. In both cases, we will go back to the steps for the single use and either assess them for the most restrictive use or for each of the individual uses in our project. So what do we mean by uses? You'll find this information in Chapter 3 of the Building Code. When we look at a building, we want to assess what people will be doing there in order to understand the level of hazard and also the level of fire safety, also the level of independence of the users themselves. As you look at this list, you're probably identifying several different use types or occupancy classifications that will apply to your project. You almost certainly will have assembly, possibly business, mercantile, and also residential. You'll want to read each of the sections to understand what's included in that occupancy type. And each of these is going to have its own building codes requirements. If we return to the flowchart, we'll see that the next step is to assess the building height, building area, and construction type that can be used for our occupancy. The information about the building size, both its height and the allowable area, can be found in the building codes in Chapter 5. You'll find two charts that address the height of the building, one in terms of the number of stories that are allowed, and the other in terms of the overall height of the building. You'll see that your allowable heights are related to the occupancy classification, but also strongly correlated with the type of construction that you plan to use. In the same chapter, you will also find tables that talk about the allowable area for the floor plate, again, given what occupancy and construction type you plan to use. As you're studying the size and height charts for your building, you will notice a direct correlation with the type of construction that you plan to use. The more fire resistive the construction, the taller and larger the project can be. This chart is not directly from the building code, but it shows you the correlation between the information. You'll notice that there are two primary categories: non-combustible and combustible materials. The 5 types of construction fall into one of those two categories. Types 1 and 2 contain the same materials, but they have different levels of fire resistance. Typically, these are steel and concrete construction. Type 3 is a more traditional construction type, and Type 4 is mill and heavy timber. In the future, all of our mass timber types will also fall under Type 4. And Type 5 is standard light wood frame construction. The other thing you'll notice from this synopsis is that the height and size will also vary based on whether or not fireproofing is used. If fire-protected construction is used, the height and size of the building can increase. Returning again to the chart, you'll see that the last step in this first part of our building codes analysis is to correlate the construction type with the size of the building. Right now, you probably know more about the size of your building, and you'll need to see what construction type is required to accommodate the size of your current design. Alternatively, you may be very committed to using a particular type of construction, and I hope that you're considering mass timber. If that's the case, we'll need to get some additional charts to see what kinds of limitations there will be on the height and area for your building. Going into the second unit of the semester is a good time to assess some of the requirements that the building code will present to your project. The first of which is probably determining the construction type and some of the construction materials as you are moving forward with your structures assignment. So you should complete the part 1 of the building codes assignment, and that will require documentation using a standard North Carolina form called Appendix B. Assignment 10 includes the link where you can find the Appendix B.